When things regress. December 21st, 2022. One of the facts you're going to have to face as a meditator is that there are times when there's progress, there are times when you seem to hit a plateau, nothing seems to go up or down, and there are times when things regress and seem to fall apart. The states of concentration you used to have, you don't have anymore, or at least you don't have them right now. The important principle is that you don't let the mind get worked up about any of those things. Ajahn Mahabua talks about the early years of his practice when his mind would settle down in ways it hadn't before. He got really excited about it, but then it would deteriorate. He'd get upset. He began to notice a pattern. It would go up for a while, and then down for a while, and he finally realized he couldn't let himself get worked up about the ups and the downs. He should just do the practice, stick to the basics. And he found that he was able to get the mind into concentration more and more consistently. So you have to apply the same principle to your own times of regress. It's a normal thing that's going to happen. The mind is a complex phenomenon. You're dealing with lots of different defilements, not just one. Ajahn Lee's image is of the difference between a banana tree growing and an oak tree growing. A banana tree has only one soft stalk to grow only in one direction. It does it pretty fast and then dies pretty fast. The oak tree has to grow sturdy branches in many directions. Its branches tend to twist around, so it's going to take a long time. Sometimes this branch gets nourished and another branch doesn't grow so much. Then the tree starts growing the second branch, and the first branch stops for a rest. So, given that your mind is complex, it's going to have its ups and downs, it's going to take time. But the basics are, to begin with, to think of the Buddha's recommendations to Rahula. The very beginning of his instructions of meditation, make your mind like earth. We tend to forget that. When things are going really well, we get puffed up. When things are going poorly, we get deflated. But notice earth, it doesn't get puffed up or deflated. You can pour garbage on the earth and it doesn't get upset. You could pour perfume on the earth and it wouldn't get excited by it. It just stays right there. Now, this doesn't mean that you'll just stay right there all the time, simply that this becomes the foundation you need for the work that has to be done. The Buddha is not saying, be passive, just accept whatever comes and don't try to do anything about it. You will have to do something about it, but to do something skillful about it, you first have to have the right attitude and not get upset by what's happening so that you can remember the lessons the Buddha taught. Think about the qualities that the Buddha said are an important part of every practice: mindfulness, alertness, ardency, so you go back to the basics. Make your mind like earth, and then try to be mindful. Here mindfulness means not remembering everything that happened in the past, but remembering what's useful to remember right now. You may know that story by Borges about a character who can't forget anything. He has total memory of everything that's happened in his life, and he's miserable because it's just so overwhelming. Our memory has to be selective. You have to choose what's useful right now. Your memory of how good the meditation used to be is not going to be useful right now. It's like remembering that you had a piece of cake a while back and it was really good, and wanting to have that same cake all over again. Well, where is the cake now? It's down in the septic tank. And even if you didn't eat it then, or there was an extra piece of cake left over that you kept all this time, it'd be moldy by now. So think of your memories of how good the meditation used to be as moldy memories. You don't want to eat moldy food. Remember that if you want results in the meditation, you have to focus on the causes. So you're mindful of the breath, each breath coming in, each breath going out. All too often, we're in so much of a rush to get on to the next step that we don't have the time to watch each breath as it's coming in, watch each breath as it's going out. Try to be right here, stay right here. As for the mind's anticipations of what's going to happen next, remember that right anticipation is not part of the path. There's a lot of anticipation in craving, but that's not what you're trying to develop. You do have a desire to do the practice, and without that desire, you can't practice. But the desire has to be focused on the causes. So be right here as much as you can. That's the alertness part. You watch what you're doing, those are the causes, and watch the results you're getting from those causes right now. Don't worry about the results you had last year or a month ago or whatever. Focus on what's actually happening right now, and you can make adjustments. Remember that when the Buddha talks about breath meditation, it's not just be with whatever breath comes in. There was a time when he was telling the monks to do breath meditation, and one of the monks piped up and said, "I do breath meditation." This was a monk who was known to be not that good at the practice, so the Buddha asked him, "But what kind of breath meditation do you do?" The monk said, "I put aside thoughts of the past, I put aside thoughts of the future. Whatever comes up, I'm equanimous in the present as I breathe in and breathe out." The Buddha said, "Well, there is that kind of breath meditation, but it's not the kind that's going to give you good results." Then he went into the 16 steps. And remember that one of those steps involves trying to be aware of the whole body as you breathe in and breathe out after you've been watching the breath for a while. So as you're watching this, you maintain a whole body awareness. Then you try to calm the breath. You don't suppress it. Just allow it to get more and more gentle as you spread your awareness to fill the body so that when the breath gets really subtle, you don't lose your focus. Your focus becomes the sense of breath energy throughout the body. You do this in such a way that you can observe what kind of breathing is most pleasant right now. And here again, don't think how pleasant it was last month. Just notice which ways of breathing are more pleasant than others right now. They may not seem all that gratifying or special, but at the very least, find a way of breathing that feels okay. If that's the best you can do, stay with okay breathing. The more you can stay with it, the more the mind can settle down, and the more refined the breath can become. This all comes under ardency. You try to do this well. Here again, the ardency has to deal with what's actually coming up in the present moment. If memories of the past are beginning to interfere, remember that they're not anything you want to focus on right now. They're unskillful thoughts that you try to abandon. The skillful thoughts are the ones that focus on, what can I do right now? I'll take on whatever I can do right now as best I can and maintain it. Sometimes, in the simple maintaining, it's going to get better. Say, you want another cake. Well, you have to cook it. You don't just stick the batter in the pan and then put it in the oven, take it out right away and say, "Gee, it's not getting cooked as fast as I wanted." So you stick it back in, then take it out again, stick it back in, take it out again. If you keep that up, it's never going to get baked. You have to stick it in and let it stay there. The difference, of course, is that when you stick a cake in the oven, you don't have distracting thoughts running around in the oven, disturbing the cake. They may be running around in your head right now, but again, you have the choice. You found yourself here. You wanted a quiet room with nobody else inside, but the room you're in has people populating it. Well, you don't have to get involved in their conversations. This is where mindfulness comes in. Try to remember what's important to remember right now and what's important to forget right now, where you pay your attention. Alertness is not all about being alert to whatever is coming up in the present moment. It's focused precisely on, what are you doing in the present moment? The other people in the room may be running around, but what are you doing? There was a time years back when I visited a school in Korea where they were teaching classical Korean music. The year before, I had learned the Korean drum to help a friend who was playing the kayagum. She had gone back to Korea, and I visited her on my way back to Thailand. She took me to the school where she had taken her lessons. It was a cacophony. They had little booths along the walls of a large room, and there were people in the booths playing different instruments or learning Korean opera. Each person really had to focus precisely on what he or she was doing and not pay attention to the music coming from the booths all around. That's how you've got to focus right now. If there's a lot of conversation in your mind, let other people in the mind carry on the conversation. You're not responsible for it. Just stay right here. What this means is that you have to get your mindfulness, alertness, and ardency well tuned. Mindful not to keep in mind how good it used to be, but mindful to remember the basic steps that will be the causes for how it's going to be good here and now. Alertness. What are you doing right now? Don't focus on other things that are going on in the mind. And ardency. If memories of the past are getting in the way, recognize them as unskillful thoughts that you have to let go. So when things are going downhill, remember, you can be saved by the basics. In the process, you'll get to know the basics even better, because you find this happening again and again and again, and you have to keep coming back to the basics and re-examining them. You'll see things in them that you didn't see before. Realize that the basics may not be as simple as you thought they were to begin with. The reason they're basic is because they uphold everything else. As you have more and more experience, you get to know the basics better. It's in this way that the meditation finally does become a skill. It requires patience and that quality of making your mind like earth, so that you're not upset by whatever happens, you're not excited by whatever happens, you take a matter-of-fact attitude. Then, based on that, go back to your basic skills. That's how the meditation deepens and grows. Self-starting. August 29, 2023. Once, when the Buddha was discussing the amazing qualities of a Buddha, he focused on things that didn't directly have to do with him, but with the people who were born during his time. He said that people usually are focused on sensuality, obsessed with sensuality, and they don't want to hear about renunciation. But it was amazing that in the time of a Buddha, there were people who did want to hear of renunciation. People are usually fascinated with becoming, but at the time of a Buddha, there would be people who would be fascinated with the idea of going beyond becoming. So, the fact that we're practicing is unusual. It's not normal, it's not ordinary. The ordinary way of the world is just to keep going around and around. The idea of getting out may occur to people sometimes, and there may be a few people who are determined to get out, but they have to be self-starters. After all, the Buddha himself was a self-starter. It's very unusual for a prince, surrounded by all the luxuries that a prince would have in those days, to think about going beyond that. There's a passage in one of the Victorian books about the Buddha, the Light of Asia, saying that the Buddha had the chance to choose between goodness and greatness, and he chose goodness. What the author meant by goodness was the goodness of a moral life. Greatness, of course, meant power. But I think the author had it backwards. Ordinary goodness, domestic goodness, is the goodness where you don't put your release from suffering first. You want to learn how to fit in, to be part of the community, part of the society. You take on all the burdens and responsibilities that come with being a social being, and you're good in that sense. But to be great, in the genuine sense, means you see that there must be something better. The mind and the heart deserve something better. After all, your body is subject to aging, illness, and death. If you're looking for happiness in things that are also subject to aging, illness, and death, there's nothing special about it, and even if you gain those things, nothing is accomplished. Think of all those eons and eons of lives that the Buddha saw that he had lived, and what was accomplished. The ones that accomplished something were the ones aimed at getting out, and that's rare. So that fact that you're here practicing, that's rare. It means you're going against a lot of your social conditioning, both good and bad, in the normal sense of the word. You realize there are certain needs for the mind, certain needs for the heart, that can't be met by ordinary social arrangements. You have to train from within, and fortunately the Buddha set out a good course of training. This is where traditional Buddhist countries differ from ours. They have a system of training for people who want to drop out, basically, whereas here in America, when people drop out, they don't have much guidance. I remember reading the book, Into the Wild, about a young man who was disillusioned with his family, disillusioned with society. He was trying to find some way of being authentic. But he didn't have much guidance, and he ended up dying because of his quest. Think of how fortunate we are that we have the Buddhist path set out for us in a way that's actually supported by the society. Here in America, it's not supported by the society at large, but there are enough Buddhists here that we can survive, we can practice, and be well supported. So try to take advantage of that, not in the sense that you're taking advantage of other people, but in the sense that you're taking advantage of an opportunity to do something special with your mind, something out of the ordinary. Ajahn Suwat commented that during his time with Ajahn Mun, one of the themes that Ajahn Mun liked to talk about most was the customs of the noble ones. He himself had come under a lot of flack, especially when he was starting out. He wanted seriously to practice the teaching that the Buddha had taught, for the purpose for which it was taught, for the sake of dispassion. That's what it means to practice the Dhamma in accordance with the Dhamma, to practice for the sake of disenchantment, for dispassion, and not simply to fulfill a social role. Monks at that time were expected to stay in the village, often they were the village doctors, to perform social services. The monks who went out into the wilds weren't trusted. We think of the forest tradition as being an integral part of Thai society, but at that time it was definitely outside of the bounds of normal Thai values. And again, Ajahn Mun had to be a self-starter. He had to see within himself that the problem of suffering was the big problem in life, and if he didn't give himself over to solving it, as he said, he'd keep coming back to be the laughingstock of his defilements. So when people criticized him for following the Dhutanga practices and not settling down, he said, "Those are the customs of ordinary Thai and Lao people, domestic society. They're the customs of people with defilements, a point that applies to the customs of any country." He was more interested in the customs of the noble ones. And one of the big customs of the noble ones is to delight in developing and to delight in abandoning. In other words, you delight in developing skillful qualities in the mind, and you delight in abandoning unskillful qualities. That delight is what keeps you going. We're not here to please anybody. As Ajahn Phuong would often say, nobody hired us to be born, nobody hired us to get ordained, nobody hired us to come here to the monastery. We've done this all of our own free will. So we don't have to please anybody, but we have to please our better selves, which means doing our best. When we find ourselves getting discouraged, we do our best to encourage ourselves. During my time with Ajahn Phuong, he never praised me to my face. I found out after he died that he'd been saying good things about me in my absence, but to my face he almost never gave me any praise. Part of the reason was, I guess, that he didn't want it to go to my head. But secondly, he wanted me to realize that I wasn't there to please him. I was there to take care of the wound in my own heart, or the many wounds in my own heart, and he wasn't going to get in the way. But he did give encouragement, and part of the encouragement was holding me to a high standard. It was up to me to figure out the reasons for why I wanted to continue with the training and to keep at it. In doing so, I developed an important part of the mind, the part that tends to get starved in regular society but is allowed to flourish when you say, it is possible to find true happiness. It comes from developing all your best qualities, and here's an opportunity to do it. So, keep reminding yourself of why you're here. The Buddha gives 3 ways of talking to yourself when you're getting discouraged. One is to take the Dhamma as a governing principle. Appreciate the fact that we have such a good Dhamma here to show us the way. It would be a shame not to take advantage of it. 2. Take yourself as a governing principle. Realize that you started on this practice not because anybody hired you or forced you. You did it of your own free will. You saw that you were suffering, and here was an opportunity to go beyond suffering. It would be a shame to turn away from that. If you really care for yourself, you stick with the practice. Then there's the world as a governing principle. Realize that there are people in the world who can read minds. When you're getting discouraged, what are they going to think if they read yours? You'd be embarrassed for them to see your thoughts. But you also realize that most people who can read minds, and the kind of people you'd want to look good in the eyes of, also have compassion. They have compassion for you in holding you to a high standard, so why don't you have compassion for yourself? These are just a few of the ways in which you can encourage yourself on the path, to keep yourself going in a way that doesn't have to depend on anyone else. This is a motivation that comes from within. This is one of the few things in the world where you are totally a self-starter, totally responsible for your own actions, in a way that doesn't harm anyone at all, and actually does a lot of good for you and for the world at large. So take heart. Not the predictable thing. September 25th, 2022. Once, I was giving a Dhamma talk in New York City. The person introducing me mentioned that I was a New Yorker myself, having been born out on the eastern end of Long Island and grown up on a potato farm. Even though it was a farm, it wasn't that far from the city. After the talk, a woman came up and mentioned that she and her family had had a vacation home in Cutchogue, which is just a few miles down the road from where I grew up. She was amazed that a little potato farm boy from the eastern end of Long Island would end up studying the Dhamma in Thailand. At first I felt a little insulted. Don't farm boys have hearts? Can't they dream? Can't they aspire to something better than what they've got? But then I realized that this is a pattern throughout the history of Buddhism. People doing unexpected things, unpredictable things. A similar incident happened when I was in Thailand. Someone new to the monastery noticed a Western monk at the monastery and so asked Ajahn Fuang, "How is it that Westerners can ordain?" His response was, "Don't Westerners have hearts?" Maybe he was sensitive to that issue because he himself had been looked down on many times. After all, he was a peasant boy, orphaned when he was very young. Looking at him from outside, you wouldn't expect anything much out of his life. But he was able to make himself something special, not because he was trying to make himself into something special, but he wanted to find something special in life. This goes for almost all of the great Ajahns, sons of peasants. Looking at them from the outside, you would have predicted either a life trying to struggle up the social ladder, or being stuck at the bottom of the social ladder, or rebelling in predictable ways. As Ajahn Fuang once told me, if it hadn't been for the Dhamma, he could have very easily ended up in a life of crime. But fortunately, he saw that there was the possibility of something better, and so he did the unpredictable thing. This is a tradition that goes back to the Buddha himself. The predictable thing for a young prince back in those days would have been to enjoy his life of pleasures, perhaps get involved in a war or two. But as he saw, that kind of life was simply looking for happiness in things that age, grow ill, and die. He himself was going to age, grow ill, and die. What would that accomplish? Isn't there something better? So he left home. At first he did some predictable things. He went to study with other teachers. But then he started doing unpredictable things. When the teachers offered to have him teach as well, he realized that what they had taught him to attain wasn't what he wanted. He wanted something better. So he tried something else that was predictable. People who have been indulging in pleasure for a long time and finally see the drawbacks of that kind of life tend to go to the other extreme. So that's just what he did. 6 years of self-torment, to the point where he realized he had tortured himself more than anyone else had ever done. But he saw that it was a dead end, literally. If he continued down that route, he would die. That's when he did something else unpredictable. He said there must be another way, and he found it. This may be one of the reasons why he was so firmly opposed to the doctrine of determinism. When he found the true way and was teaching it, he wasn't the kind of person who would usually go out and look for people to argue with, but there were a few cases where he did. One of them was when he sought out some teachers who taught that everything you experience in the present moment is determined by the past, either by the actions of a creator deity or your own past karma. He would argue with those people. If everything you experience right now is determined by the past, he said, then if you're going to kill right now, steal right now, have illicit sex right now, that's all been determined by the past. You can't have any choice in the matter. In that case, there is no should be done or shouldn't be done. People just do what they have to do. When you teach that, you're leaving people unprotected, bewildered. In other words, they're just stuck in the original problem of suffering. They're bewildered by the pain. And because they're told that they have no way of dealing with it, they're unprotected. They have no reason for trying to say no to their unskillful urges. He saw the importance of the fact that there is an opportunity for freedom in the present moment. Not everything you're experiencing right now has been determined by the past. You can make a difference. You don't have to do the predictable thing. As when you're sitting here right now, when things are going well, the predictable thing is to get carried away and complacent. But what if you did something unpredictable? Tell yourself, okay, no, I've got something good going on here. What's the best thing to do with my concentration? Is this the time to maintain it? Or is this the time to use it for something else? When things are not going well, the predictable thing is to get upset, and you can go into a downward spiral. But how about doing the unpredictable thing, not getting upset? See what happens when you're with a state of mind in the present moment that's not good, but you're not upset by it. This doesn't mean you say, well, I'll just accept it and be okay with it. That's another predictable thing. Ask yourself, what can I learn? What would be the best thing to do with this state of mind? That attitude is what allowed the Buddha to do those unpredictable things. He kept asking, what's the best thing to do with what I've got? Once he got into right concentration, he didn't just stay in concentration. He asked himself, is there knowledge that can be derived from this state of concentration? The first question he asked himself to gain knowledge was, how about previous births? Have I been born before? He saw that he had. He could see back many, many thousands of eons. The predictable thing then would have been to set himself up as a teacher with knowledge of past lives, but he said, no. What's the best thing to do with this knowledge? That question led to another question. What causes the patterns and the ups and downs of previous lifetimes? That's when he gained his second knowledge, seeing beings dying and being reborn in line with their karma, and seeing how complex karma was. There's a basic principle that's pretty simple. You act on skillful intentions and you get good results, good rebirths. You act on unskillful intentions, you get bad results, bad rebirths. But even though the principle is simple, its working out is not. It's not automatic that what you do in one lifetime will determine what's going to happen in the next lifetime, because you have other karmic influences coming in from the past, perhaps other lifetimes, and then there's the influence of your views and intentions at the moment of death. Those actions can have an influence as well. Here again, he could have set himself up as a teacher, teaching people about karma and rebirth. But then he asked himself, what's the best use of this knowledge? One of the things he had seen in the way karma worked out was that your state of mind at death could actually go against a lot of karmic tendencies coming in from the past. In other words, if your state of mind at death was really good, it could compensate for a lot of bad things you'd done. If your state of mind at death was bad, it could delay the results of past good karma, which meant that the state of your mind in the present moment doesn't have to be shaped by the past. And it can counteract influences coming in from the past. So the next question was, what's the best use of that knowledge? Here, the answer was, see what you can do in the present moment to get out of this system entirely. That's a question that would have been totally unpredictable, aside from the fact that the Buddha-to-be really wanted freedom. This is the one thing you could say was predictable once you knew him as a person. He would do everything for the sake of freedom. But people like that are hard to predict. Sociologists look at classes of people and say, this class of people will tend in this direction, that class will tend in that direction. But what they can't see is who among those people would really do everything for the sake of freedom. Even the Buddha himself couldn't say. There was that time when he was asked if the whole world was going to go to awakening, or half the world, or a third of the world. He refused to answer. The Brahmin who asked the question seemed upset, so then Ananda pulled him aside and gave him an analogy. Suppose there's a fortress with an intelligent gatekeeper. He walks around the fortress, inspecting the wall. Aside from the one main gate into the fortress, he doesn't see a hole big enough even for a cat to slip through. So as a result, what does he know? He doesn't know how many people are going to come in and out of the fortress, but he does know that if they're going to come in and go out, they're going to come in and out through the gate. In the same way, the Buddha doesn't know how many people will choose to want to do the unpredictable thing and go for total freedom. But the ones who will go for total freedom will have to follow this path, the 10 guidelines for moral action, the 4 establishings of mindfulness, the 7 factors for awakening. So remember, we have this opportunity to be unpredictable. We live in a monastery where the routine is pretty standard. The predictable response is either to simply fall into the routine or to try to rebel against the routine. The unpredictable thing is to use this opportunity to find freedom, freedom from your defilements, because the defilements are giving you the worst routines. When the meditation goes well, the defilements tell you to get excited or complacent. When the meditation doesn't go well, the defilements tell you, maybe it's better that you give up, or they just get you depressed. So try to work free of the routines of the defilements. You know your predictable patterns, but you don't have to follow them. That's why the Buddha, when he gave his shorter synopsis of the awakening, boiled it down to a pattern of causality in which what happens in the present moment is shaped partly by the past, but also partly by independent decisions in the present moment itself, and those are free. They don't have to be predictable. So take advantage of that. It's because of that principle that meditation can take you someplace that you wouldn't have predicted, something surprisingly good. Think outside the ruts. March 26, 2022. There's a strange passage in the canon where the Buddha talks about how we take the potential for a form, feeling, perception, fabrication, or consciousness, and we fabricate it into an actual aggregate of form, feeling, etc., for the sake of having that aggregate. It's expressed in a strange way in the Pali, but the basic message is, all our experience is for the sake of something. It's purposeful. This is why we have questions about what the meaning of life is, hoping that somehow the for the sake of can be determined. Otherwise, we're pretty much making stabs in the dark, making things up as we go along, trying to figure out what will make us happy. Usually that's what that for the sake of is, to find happiness of some kind. We do our best to find some pleasure. The question is our best good enough? As the Buddha pointed out, we're usually operating in ignorance, which means that we end up creating suffering instead. We're ignorant of what we're doing. Our ideas of what's worth doing and what's not worth doing can be really skewed, because our perceptions are skewed. There are 4 aberrations of perception the Buddha talks about: seeing constancy in things that are inconstant, seeing ease in things that are stressful, seeing self in things that are not self, and seeing beauty in things that are not beautiful. Those are the big ones. But if you look at how the mind operates, there are lots of variations on those themes, because every time we do something, think something, or say something, it's for the purpose of something, and we think it's worth it. Basically, what discernment teaches us is that a lot of the things we think are worth doing are not worth doing at all. Our perceptions have been skewed one way or another. We have to learn to develop some dispassion for them so that we can get out of them, because they tend to be like ruts in the mind. The Buddha uses the word, bending the mind. You keep thinking in certain ways and the mind gets bent in those directions. Nowadays, we'd say they're like ruts, like a rut in a road. You get stuck in the rut and it takes a lot of energy to get out. In the same way, the mind just follows its old patterns again and again and again, even though there may not be much allure. It's simply a question of what it's familiar with, and it would take a lot of energy to change. One of the purposes of meditation is to try to get out of those ruts, to think in new ways, to think at cross purposes with the ruts. If you've ever tried to get out of a rut in the road, you've noticed that you have to turn the wheel at a really sharp angle to get out. In the same way, you have to learn how to think in radically new angles. One of the major causes of ruts in the mind is that we have limits in the way we think. There seem to be only 1 or 2 alternatives that are worth doing or worth thinking about at any one time. But when you have only 2 alternatives, it's like politics. Think of all the wonderful people who could be really good presidents in the United States, but somehow the sorting out situation gets down to 2 people who are not really worth voting for at all. Then we get really worked up about which one is the lesser of 2 evils, trying to see the lesser of 2 evils as actually something good. The problem is with the sorting out process. It's the same with the mind. The mind has its way of sorting out things, saying, this has to be that way, that has to be this way, and denying other alternatives. So, when you find the mind in a rut, you have to ask yourself, are there any other possibilities? Maybe there are 3 or 4 possibilities, or maybe we're asking the wrong question. As I said, we often find ourselves doing things that we know are harmful, that cause suffering. When we ask ourselves, what's the allure? There doesn't seem to be much. It's because we've caught ourselves in a box. So, when you find yourself faced with 2 alternatives like that, ask yourself, maybe there are other alternatives, maybe there's another way of dividing up the territory. There's that whole issue of, I do everything just for me, 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 and it becomes a very horrible me, and as long as you think there's only one me in there, it's really difficult to figure out exactly what is it that the me wants. But when you start dividing it up, you see that there are lots of little me's in there. Then the question becomes, what does this me want right now? What does that me want right now? That changes things. You're not stuck with just 1 or 2 alternatives. So, learn how to turn your thoughts inside out. We know that the Buddha's analysis of things is, The way you gain insight is to look for the origination of something, and the origination is in the mind itself. When the Buddha uses the word origination, it's not just arising. Something is caused, and it's caused from within the mind. You want to look for the cause. So when a certain thought pattern comes up, try to look and see, when it arises, what's coming up with it, what's pushing it into or out of your mind. Sometimes these thoughts seem to arise simply because of the force of past karma, but there'll be a present karma addition. Look for that. In fact, the Pali word for origination, samadaya, means something arising together. So, what's coming up together at the same time? We like to talk about deep underlying causes, but maybe the cause is right there on the surface, so much on the surface, like a film on the surface of water, that we look right through it. Then try to see, when that thought is allowed to pass away on its own, how did it pass away, and what causes it to come back? Because then you'll see, there's part of the mind that's not allowing it to pass away. That's the part you want to look at. What's the allure driving it? Sometimes it'll just say, well, this is just the way it has to be. That's why you find yourself ending up doing things that you know are really not all that good and don't have that much allure, but you blocked off better alternatives. So, you want to see the sorting out process. How did you block them out? It's when you see that you begin to understand the allure of certain things, because the allure is not so much in the thought, it's in the way of thinking that's got you trapped. That's something you want to learn how to step out of. It's hard to figure out precisely what the problem is unless you have a place to stand outside of it. That's what the breath provides, a place to stand outside your thoughts. You can be with the breath coming in, breath going out, bathing your body in the breath, bathing your own sense of you in the breath, you inhabiting the body. You want to fully inhabit the body so that you can get out of your mind, or at the very least get out of the discussion inside, and gain a chance to rest from it. This is why we talk about the karate chops. Sometimes your old thoughts will come in, and you've got to have a quick retort to get them out of the way. This is one of the reasons why we read those books of short Dhamma passages by Ajahn Fuang, Ajahn Lee, Ajahn Chah, because they give some ideas on how you can stop a thought in its track with a few well-chosen words and step out of it. You see a student coming to say something really stupid to Ajahn Fuang, and he's got a quick retort. Sometimes what the student said doesn't seem all that stupid to begin with, but Ajahn Fuang's got a good retort and you see that, yes, what the student thought was stupid. Where did Ajahn Fuang learn that ability? By learning how to use karate chops on his own thoughts. Not that he was sitting around trying to think of clever things to say to people. He was trying to think of clever things to do with his own defilements, to cut them out for the time being so that he could gain some space for the mind to settle down. Then, when it's settled down, that's when you can do the real work, beginning to see the assumptions that place limitations on your thoughts, because those are the things that have the allure. This way, you can start questioning things, more in the sense of, why do you like this way of thinking? Part of the mind will say, well, this is the way things are. This is the way I put together my reality, and it's worked good enough for me. Well, if it really were working good enough, it wouldn't be causing suffering like this. They've discovered that, as children develop, it's not that they simply add new information to what they've had before. They go through periods where they develop a paradigm, their understanding of the world, but then finally the new information gets so dissonant with their understanding of the world that they've got to drop the old paradigm, drop the old structure of their thoughts, and come up with a new structure. They do this in several stages. That's how they grow. That's how they mature. The problem is, as adults, we figure that we've got our structure and it works. And the Buddha's saying, no, the way you structure your thinking is causing you to suffer. So, you have to look at the larger pattern, because that, as I said, is where the allure lies. Then, when you can see its drawbacks, it's a lot easier to get rid of the individual thoughts that are coming in, driving you crazy. So, the ruts in the mind are not so much individual thoughts, they're patterns of thinking that we hold to. This is one of the reasons why it's so important to see that, as we're bringing the Dhamma to the West, we shouldn't be in such a great hurry to make the Dhamma fit in with our Western views of reality. After all, our views of reality are making us suffer. The Dhamma is offering us another way of looking at reality altogether. Learn how to use the teaching on karma, learn how to use the teaching on rebirth in a skillful way so that you can come up with new narratives, new patterns of thinking that don't cause you to suffer. So, think outside the ruts. Turn at sharp angles from them. It takes effort because you have to figure out exactly where the ruts are. And because you're in the ruts, they seem a very natural place to be. But the mind doesn't have to stay in those ruts. That's the good news. It's simply a matter of learning how to take that good news and seeing how you can apply it to the way the mind is making itself suffer right here and now. You can let go of the things that you thought were worth holding on to. You see that they really do cause you to suffer, but you don't have to think in those terms. That's when the Dhamma gets liberating. Ugly body, happy mind. March 20th, 2023. Gladdening the mind is an important part of meditation. It's listed as one of the steps in breath meditation, and there are many places where the Buddha talks about how creating a sense of gladness, a sense of well-being, is an important prelude to getting the mind to settle down. He also talks about two ways in which you develop that sense of gladness. One is through getting the mind to be tranquil and calm. He talks about breathing in such a way that feels comfortable and then spreading that sense of comfort throughout the body. Another way to gladden the mind is through insight. He talks about what he calls renunciation gladness, when you see that all the things in the senses, sight, sounds, smells, taste, and tactile sensations, are inconstant and not worthy of attachment. The fact that you're able to lift your mind above those things can make you glad. So when you find that the meditation is down and you're feeling discouraged, think of ways to lift up and gladden the mind. And have a broad repertoire for how you're going to do that. There's the passage where the Buddha is talking to Rahula, teaching him how to meditate, and before he talks about breath meditation, he gives him a series of other contemplations, contemplating the body in terms of elements or properties, contemplating the four Brahma Viharas, and contemplating the foulness of the body. We don't usually think of that last contemplation as a way of gladdening the mind. In fact, the Buddha himself lists it as a painful practice. Yet when you can think in ways that lift you above your ordinary obsessions with the body, that can give a sense of refreshment, a sense of expansiveness. You'll notice when you're focused on the body as being attractive, you usually focus on certain details that set you off. You have to narrow your vision to a really narrow tunnel vision to do that, because the things you find so attractive are right next to things that are not attractive at all. Just go down beneath the skin a tiny bit, and there's a lot of stuff you wouldn't want to get anywhere near if the skin weren't there. But the fact that the skin is there makes a big difference. Why is that? You see that the practice of contemplating the foulness of the body is not so much to get down on the body, it's to learn how to understand your mind. Why is it that you can do this practice of going through the body section by section, organ by organ, each of the 32 parts, and you can admit that there's nothing attractive about any of them when they're taken alone, and then the mind switches, and all of a sudden they're attractive again. We're a slave to that switch, so that's what you want to contemplate. All the contemplations ultimately get down to understanding perceptions. When the Ajahns talk about contemplating feelings, especially feelings of pain, the issue comes down to, what's creating a bridge between the physical pain and the pain that you're suffering from in the mind? It's a perception. What kind of perception? Why do you think in those terms? The same with the contemplation of the parts of the body. The Buddha recommends that you start with your own body first, and then realize that any other body you're attracted to has pretty much the same parts. There may be a few details different here and there, but it's all the same stuff. So why do you let yourself get so attracted to that? Part of it, of course, is that you want to find yourself attractive. Most of us find it exciting to think of ourselves as attractive. We fantasize about other people finding us so attractive that they can't resist us. What's that all about? That attractiveness then gets reflected back to us when we see other people's bodies as being attractive. Why do we do this? What does the mind want to accomplish? What's the allure? And how can you see through that? One way, as I said, is to think about how the parts that you're attracted to are very near parts that are not attractive at all. Why is it that you're able to perceive such a clear, distinct, firm line between them? There's no such line in the body itself. So you want to see why you're doing this to yourself, and also, how you don't have to. The Buddha says you're not going to get past lust, you're not going to get past attraction to the body until you hit non-return. So this issue is always going to be there until then. It's interesting that non-return is also the point where you've perfected concentration. So when you can get the mind concentrated, focusing on the breath, getting some gladness out of the calm, see if you can also get some gladness out of the insight that comes when you contemplate the things that have tied you down for who knows how long. As Ajahn Fuang pointed out, the things that we lust after, the things that we desire strongly in terms of the senses, are things we've had in the past. We miss them, which is why we want them back again. As he said, if you think about that a bit, it's enough to give rise to a real sense of samvega. After all, if you get them again, you're going to lose them again, and you're going to lust after them again and miss them again. It's like that carrot they used to get a donkey to move. They put it on a string, hang it from a stick, and dangle it just a little bit out of the donkey's reach. The donkey goes after it, keeps going, and of course the carrot gets further and further away. Every now and then they'll give it a bite, then they'll hang it out far away again. How much longer do you want to be in that position, chasing something that's being dangled just out of reach in front of your nose? It's when you can see through the attractiveness, or why the mind wants to deceive itself around this, that's when the mind can get glad, because there's a gladness that comes with the freedom that you don't need that kind of stuff anymore. You're not a slave to that anymore. So when the time comes to gladden the mind, have a wide repertoire of the things you can use to gladden it with. That way, you can find a way of keeping the mind interested in the meditation, keeping it happy to be here working on its internal problems. You have to remember, we're really fortunate we have this opportunity. Look at the world outside. There are all kinds of disturbances going on, all kinds of conflict. Most people don't have time to just stop and breathe, but as you're listening to this, you do have that opportunity, so make the most of it. Gladden the mind so that it can keep on going. Think of the Buddha's instructions to Rahula. When you realize that you've done something well, be gladdened by that, and then use that sense of gladness to further your practice, to get even more diligent. In that way, you use the gladness for something even better. One of the forest Ajahns, who's reputed to be an arahant, said that when he was able to get past his attraction to the human body, he could see the auras of people. So when you think thoughts of the unattractiveness of the body, don't think that you're cutting off an avenue to pleasure. You're opening up the mind to possibilities that you may not have thought of. So even though it's listed as a painful practice, contemplation of the body can be gladdening because it's liberating. The gladness of liberation is the best form of gladness there is. Fourth Truth, First Duty. July 23, 2023. When the Buddha gave his first sermon, the topic was the Four Noble Truths, but he didn't start with the first truth. He started with the fourth, the path. In doing so, he showed that that was what the truths were all about. That's the purpose they served, as part of the path to the end of suffering. But you can also take this fact as meaning that of the different duties for the truths, the duty for the path is the one you work on first. You try to develop it, all the factors, right view down through right concentration, and by developing it, you're getting yourself ready to perform the duties for the other truths, to comprehend suffering, to abandon its cause, and to realize its cessation. So focus on what you're doing right now to develop the path. Right now you're working on right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. You find a topic, like the breath, and you stay focused there. Keep track of the breath coming in, going out. In the beginning, you simply discern how the breath is going in the body right now, whether it's long or short, but then you train yourself. You train yourself to be aware of the whole body as you breathe in, the whole body as you breathe out. You train yourself to calm what the Buddha calls bodily fabrication, which is the in and out breath. He calls it that because he wants to call attention to the fact that there's an intentional element in how you breathe. That's going to play a huge role in the rest of the breath meditation, because you can then intentionally train yourself to breathe in a way that feels refreshing, train yourself to breathe in a way that feels pleasant, train yourself to be sensitive to how feelings and perceptions play a role in influencing your mind. In this case, that means the feelings of pleasure you're trying to create, along with the perception, the image of the breath that you hold in mind to stay with the breath. You can picture the breath to yourself in any number of ways. Think of it as the energy flowing through the body. After all, the Buddha lists breath not as the tactile sensation at the nose, but as part of the wind element in the body itself. That's energy, the energy that allows the air to come in through the nose and allows it to go out. Where do you feel that energy? If you can perceive it as a whole body process, going down through all the nerves and blood vessels, that allows the sense of ease, fullness, and refreshment to spread throughout the whole body. It opens up channels in the body that otherwise you may have forced to close because your imagination couldn't think of them as possibly being open. Then you train yourself to calm the feelings and the perceptions. In other words, you try to see which perception of breath is most calming to the mind, which feelings are most calming to the mind. If you have any background in what the Buddha said about the first noble truth, you begin to realize you're dealing directly with some of the aggregates right here. You've got the form of the body, which is the breath. You've got the feeling of pleasure that you're trying to create. You've got the perceptions, the mental images, the mental labels that you hold in mind. You've got the process of fabrication, the way you breathe, the way you talk to yourself as you're doing this and as you hold perceptions in mind. Those are 4 of the 5 aggregates, and then of course you've got consciousness, which is aware of all these things. So in the course of developing concentration, you're getting hands-on experience with the aggregates. This is going to be really important because in the Buddha's analysis, suffering is clinging to the aggregates. So you're getting to know the aggregates as you develop them in the right direction. It's one of the ways in which developing the path helps you to comprehend suffering, which is the duty with regard to the first noble truth. You get to see what these aggregates are. Especially when you start out, the term aggregates makes them sound like things. And you may wonder, why is the Buddha dividing your experience up into things like this? But as you're getting hands-on experience with them, as you bring the mind to a state of concentration through right mindfulness, you begin to see that their activities, feelings feel, perceptions perceive, fabrications fabricate, consciousness cognizes. They're defined by the activity they do. And you can begin to see how you constantly hold on to those activities, which is what suffering is. Now, for the sake of concentration, you do want to hold on to them for the time being. But an important part of both right mindfulness and right concentration is that you put aside any thoughts, any aggregates, about anything else that has to do with the world. You begin to see that those are perceptions and fabrications too. This will sensitize you to other perceptions, other fabrications, and other feelings as you go through the day. After all, the work we do with the breath here isn't meant to be done only while you're sitting here with your eyes closed. These are skills you can carry with you as you go through the rest of the day. There are times when you're engaged in other work, and it may be too much to be engaged in the work and have a sense of when the breath is coming in, when the breath is going out, but you can have a general sense of how the breath energy feels throughout the body. It's a general feeling tone, and you can keep it relaxed. If you sense yourself tensing up, you automatically relax it again, breathe through the tension. Again, hands-on experience with feelings and perceptions. You begin to see the ways in which you really do make yourself suffer by the way you cling to unskillful fabrications, unskillful feelings and perceptions. Then you can ask yourself why. You'll see that a lot of them have to do with sensuality. Sensuality in the Buddhist terminology deals not so much with the actual sensual pleasures themselves, but more with the mind's fascination with thinking about them. You begin to realize that that fascination is one of the big enemies as you're trying to get the mind into concentration. But getting the mind into concentration helps you separate yourself out from that kind of thinking, gives you an alternative form of pleasure, what the Buddha calls the pleasure of form, sitting here breathing as you inhabit the body and sense the body from within, the whole body, from the head down to the feet. You can make it all pleasurable by the way you breathe and by the way you perceive the breath. That gives you a good alternative to sensual pleasure. As the Buddha said, for most of us our only alternative to pain is sensuality. That's as far as we can see things, as far as our imagination goes. The practice of concentration actually stretches your imagination, stretches the range of your experience here. It gives you new options. As the Buddha said further, if you don't have this alternative form of pleasure, the mind is going to go back to sensuality, no matter how much you tell yourself about the drawbacks of sensuality. So you're strengthening yourself at the same time that you're sensitizing yourself to how you put your experience together and how you have choices in putting your experience together. These are things you learn by developing the path. They help you see your clingings and your cravings a lot more clearly. And you can see the drawbacks of your cravings, which enables you to perform the duty with regard to them, which is to abandon them. So the path comes first. When you develop the path, it gets you started on performing the other duties with regard to the truths. So focus your attention here. Get really good at this. Develop this as a skill, and you're going to learn a lot about the mind. You're going to learn about the body and the processes by which you ordinarily cause suffering for yourself. And you get insight into how you don't have to do that anymore. This is where your main focus should be. The Buddha calls right concentration the heart of the path, while the other factors of the path are its requisites or supports. So place your attention right here. Work on these skills. You don't have to know too much about Buddhist theory in order to do this, but you find that you'll learn an awful lot about what the Buddha is talking about. Not only what he's talking about, but also about how to do the duties he set out. So stay focused on the breath. You don't even have to think about right mindfulness or right concentration. Just be focused on the breath, making it comfortable, allowing that sense of comfort to spread throughout the body, then maintaining that as best you can. Your mindfulness and concentration will develop without your having to think about them. Then everything else you need to know will appear right here. Attention and intention. Navigation book / meditations 12 / attention and intention. October 31st, 2023. On the night of his awakening, the Buddha discovered that people's lives, and particularly their experiences of pleasure and pain, were influenced by their acts of intention and acts of attention. The intentions, of course, were the intentions that drove their actions. These intentions, in turn, were influenced by what they paid attention to and who they paid attention to. The what was a matter of right views and wrong views. The who concerned the issue of whether, in forming their views, they paid attention to the teachings of the noble ones. This pairing of attention and intention runs very deep throughout the whole teaching. Attention basically comes down to paying attention not only to what you believe is true, but also to what you believe is important to know about, what's important to have views about. This is why the Buddha described attention as an issue concerning which questions you pay attention to and which questions you put aside. A lot of questions, he said, are totally useless when it comes to putting an end to suffering. You want to focus your attention on questions that, when you answer them, help in that direction. This is why he defined appropriate attention as focusing on two issues. One is what is skillful or unskillful to do with your thoughts, words, and deeds. The other issue is the Four Noble Truths. These two issues are connected in that the Four Noble Truths take the principle of skillful and unskillful action and apply it specifically to the question of why there's suffering and how you put an end to it. Unskillful actions in this context would equal the second noble truth, the cause of suffering. Skillful actions would equal the fourth noble truth, the truth of the path. That's attention. Then your intentions are to act on those truths. The interaction of attention and intention basically defines what the Buddha calls the strength of conviction. Conviction is defined in terms of who you believe, what you believe, and what you do as a result of those beliefs. You believe people who have integrity. What you believe is that your actions can, if they're skillful enough, put an end to suffering. That has a lot of implications. The fact that you can choose skillful actions over unskillful actions means that you have the power of choice. The fact that you can see the results of your actions means that you can recognize mistakes and learn from them. As a result, you can begin to anticipate that a particular action will lead in a particular direction, so you're responsible for what you do, you're responsible for the results. But most importantly, you're free to choose. You do have that freedom. We're not here just to accept causes and conditions as they play themselves out, or, as someone once said, to simply witness empty phenomena rolling on. We play a role in their rolling. We roll some things up the hill and some things down the hill. All this is part of what you do, based on who you believe and what you believe, and in particular, what your beliefs tell you to pay attention to. This means that, after paying attention to the noble ones who teach you these things, you have to pay attention to your actions, to see if they're skillful. That the Buddha describes as an act of judgment. You weigh what's right and wrong. Then your intention is to carry through with what you've observed, to abandon anything you judge to be unskillful, and to do what you judge to be skillful in all situations. This grows from conviction into the two discernment factors in the Noble Eightfold Path, right view and right resolve. Conviction is essentially mundane right view. Noble right view pays attention to the questions of what suffering is, what's causing suffering, and what you can do to put an end to that suffering. Right view is not just a collection of some interesting facts about suffering. It's also stating that this is the big issue you should pay attention to. Right resolve starts on the mundane level by applying the insights of right view to your actions. It consists of three intentions: the intention to renounce sensuality, your fascination with thinking thoughts about sensual pleasures, the intention to renounce ill will, the desire to see other people suffer or get theirs, and the intention to renounce harmfulness. The noble level of right resolve carries all three of these intentions to a higher level in focusing on the intentions that put the mind into the first jhana, the first stage of right concentration. It's in this way that these two mental functions, attention and intention, work together in guiding the path. Then, based on the acts of attention and intention in right view and right resolve, you develop the rest of the path factors. These, of course, include right concentration, which is what we're trying to do right now. Its connection with right resolve shows that it very definitely is composed of acts of intention. You intend to pay attention consistently to one object, and you're going to fight off all the other intentions that would pull you away from that first intention. The reason you do this, of course, is because you realize that this is part of the path to the end of suffering. It's something to be developed as part of the path. It's important that you remember that we're on a path here. There's sometimes a temptation, when the concentration is good, to just lie down in the middle of the road. It feels good to be here. Everything is settled, balanced inside. You just want to stay. And it is good to stay, up to a certain extent, because the mind does need to rest. It's like being outside on a cold night like this and lying down on an asphalt road warmed by the sun during the day. It's certainly better than lying down on a patch of brambles, i.e., the pleasures and pains of the senses. The Buddha's image of going through the world of our senses is that it's like being a flayed cow standing next to a bush that harbors lots of biting insects. The insects come to bite, 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 and chew, chew, chew away at the cow's wounds. They keep coming and coming, coming, these sensory contacts. Some of them have only a little impact on the mind. Some of them have a huge impact on the mind, but they all bite, bite, bite away. Ajahn Fuang once described an experience he had in his meditation. Looking back on it, I'd say that he was probably talking about his experience of stream entry. He said he came out of it and realized that as soon as you open your eyes, there's pain. As soon as you engage in the senses, there's pain. That's the primary meaning of the word dukkha. Some people translate that as unsatisfactoriness, but that's a very unsatisfactory translation. You don't say, I have an unsatisfactoriness in my hip. You have pain in your hip. And it's important that you realize that, in comparison to what the mind could be experiencing right now, even the most pleasant experiences in terms of sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and tactile sensations are painful compared to the deathless. It's because of the third noble truth that we have the motivation to stick with the path, to keep on paying attention to the things the Buddha tells us to pay attention to, and to maintain our intention to keep developing the path. So we do that as part of the work of right view and right resolve. We know that the duty with regard to the suffering and pain of clinging is to comprehend it. Our duty with regard to the cause of suffering, craving, is to abandon it. So to get to work on our duties, we start looking at the things we hold on to, the things we cling to, the things we crave, in light of the three perceptions of inconstancy, stress, and not self. It's a choice we make. Here again, there's an intention involved. As the Buddha said, fabricated things do offer their pleasures. Sights, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile sensations and ideas, form, feeling, perceptions, thought fabrications, and consciousness can be very pleasant. He doesn't deny it. But he says that if you focus on their pleasures, it just gives rise to more passion. And it's because of our passions that we keep getting involved in these things, craving them and clinging to them. From his point of view, that's how we make ourselves suffer, through our passions. So we take his teachings seriously. He's one of the people we pay attention to, ideally, the primary one. We focus on the drawbacks of fabrications, seeing that they are inconstant, i.e., that the pleasure they offer is undependable, and because it's undependable, it's painful. Because it's undependable and painful, the question is it worth laying claim to as yourself when you go around engaging in I-making and my-making? Is it really worthwhile? With some things at some stages in the path, the answer is actually yes, because we use some of the aggregates to make the path, so you hold on there. But with other things, the things that would pull you off the path, you learn to say, no, I'm going to pay attention to the fact that they're inconstant, stressful, and not self so as to induce a sense of dispassion for them. Anything that would pull you off the path, away from your precepts, away from your concentration, away from the exercise of your discernment, you've got to view in such a way as to see that it's not really worth it. Pay attention to its drawbacks. Ultimately, you get to the point where you can turn around and pay attention to the drawbacks of the path itself. You realize that although the road is nice and warm to lie down on, it's ultimately unsafe because it too is composed of aggregates of form, feeling, perceptions, thought constructs, and consciousness. Aging, illness, and death could come along in a car and run you over. So when you've rested enough, you have to get up and move further along. The Buddha's image is that we're on a raft crossing a river. When you're still in the middle of the river, don't be too quick to let go of the raft or you'll drown. Wait until you've gotten to the far shore, then you let go. But all the way across the river, from this shore to the far shore, it's a matter of developing attention and intention. You let go of these activities only when you've perfected them. You've paid attention to things that really are important to pay attention to. You've acted on skillful intentions in light of what you've seen. You keep doing this on higher and more refined levels. In this way, these two themes, attention and intention, play a role all along the path, just that they get more and more subtle as you progress. They get closer and closer to each other as you pay more careful attention to your intentions, and you intend to pay attention more and more precisely to the things the Buddha said you really should pay attention to. Your focus narrows down, but not in a way that's confining. Instead, it's getting more and more to the point, the whole point of what the Buddha taught. That's why the Buddha said that the path is nourished by commitment and reflection. You commit yourself to doing it. You focus your intentions on really following the path, and then you reflect. You pay attention to what the results are. And then, based on what you've seen, you try to fine-tune your intentions again, and again, and again. As you work on developing these two qualities together, they can take you far.